Welcome to Gear Talk, a podcast on biblical theology. Today, Brian Verrett takes us on a journey in understanding how Genesis portrays Adam as a king, a priest, and a failure.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to Gear Talk. This is Brian Verrett with the second entry in our series and trek through 1st and 2nd Samuel. The first episode in this series, we actually didn't quite get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, and today we aren't either. This is looks to be an 8-part series, and there are things that we needed to cover before we could jump into Samuel. And in the first episode, what we talked about was that there are assumptions. The people who wrote the Bible and the author of 1st and 2nd Samuel by the Spirit's power is no exception, that these people who wrote the Bible had assumptions when they wrote. They just assumed that you knew certain things, and every author does. I mean, have you ever opened up a book and the introduction of the book says that these are words, and I'm an author, and you are the reader, and I'm communicating with words because I think that they convey meaning? Nobody writes like that because everybody just assumes that if you're picking up a book, you can read it, and you know what words are. And that's a pretty big assumption, and yet we all make it. And that might sound kind of silly, but the point is simple. Everyone who writes with certain assumptions. And I said that you're not going to be able to really understand Samuel's big message, 1st and 2nd Samuel's big message, unless you're aware of the things that he's assuming. So I think the point of 1st and 2nd Samuel is that Jesus is the Messiah, the priest king who will defeat the serpent and bring his people into a new creation forever. But why would Samuel be hoping for a priest king to defeat the serpent? Is there any reason why that would be something he would be thinking about and want to tell you about? And there is. There is. And we're going to look at that today as we turn to Genesis 1 through 3 and think through some of these narratives back in the very beginning of the Bible. And we'll see that the reason Samuel expects a priest king to come and defeat the serpent is because Adam was a priest king who failed to defeat the serpent, failed to live righteously in the face of temptation, failed to overcome evil and temptation. And so it's because the first priest king failed to defeat this serpent that the author of Samuel expects that when he starts talking about a priest king who will defeat the serpent, you will just have all these bells ringing in your mind from Genesis and Genesis's first couple chapters. And so today we're going to dive into this first assumption that the author of Samuel is making, that you are aware that Adam is a failed priest king, and that because he's a failure, he's responsible for the ruin of creation, and he's also responsible for humanity's oppression under sin and death. So it's to this big assumption that we're going to turn now, and it's got 2 parts, and we'll look at some more assumptions later on in the next episode, episode 3. But in this one, this episode, these 2 parts to this assumption mainly. And the first is that Adam is a king, and the second is that Adam is a priest. Those are the 2. And so you might be wondering, what could he possibly have in mind? How do you read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and you see Adam as a priest and Adam as a king? Or maybe, as soon as I say that, you actually have some ideas start forming in your head. You say, no, I think I can see where that comes from. So I'm going to go over some reasons why you should think that Adam was a king and that Adam was a priest. But these are by no means all the reasons. Certainly not. There's more, way more. And really, to answer this question is to study the entire Bible. But we're just going to key in on some of the reasons that I find most helpful. So first we'll talk about Adam as a king. Do you remember what God told Adam to do in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28? Let me read it. And God blessed them, that's Adam and Eve, the man and the woman. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. And here's the key. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Did you hear it? Did you hear the key words? And have dominion. That word that gets translated have dominion, it occurs about 22 times in the Old Testament to mean to rule or to exercise authority over. And there's all kinds of people who exercise authority in the Old Testament. Israelite men would exercise authority and rule and have dominion over other Israelite slaves, Leviticus 25:43. Foreign nations had dominion and exercised authority over Israel when they conquered them time and time again in the book of Judges and so forth. See that in Nehemiah 9:28. Let me read that verse for you. But after they had rest, that's the Israelites had rest, they did evil again before you, and you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so that they had dominion over them. Yet when they turned and cried to you, you heard from heaven, and many times you delivered them according to your mercies. Priests also have dominion, or exercise authority with this verb that's used here in Genesis 1. Jeremiah 5:31, the prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule at their direction. My people love to have it so, but what will you do when the end comes? Asks Jeremiah. Jeremiah is clearly bringing judgment, but he mentions that the priests rule. So this word for rule clearly isn't limited to kings. Other people do it, like Israelites who own a slave, or the foreign nations did it over Israel, or priests do it. But the word tends to show up and get used an awful lot for what kings do. Because who has authority but a king? If anybody has authority and exercises dominion over others, it's surely a king. And one thing that's fascinating is this word being used, the Hebrew word is radah. The word being used, it tends to show up in passages about the Messiah. So I'll just read a couple of these now. So you'll see that this is, in large part, a kingly word. It's kings who most of all exercise dominion or authority. So here's what Balaam has to say about Jesus in Numbers 24. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. So that's a scepter. That's a kingly term. Kings have scepters. Balaam continues, this star and this scepter will crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemies, shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion. There it is, exercise dominion, and destroy the survivors of the cities. So Balaam is expecting this new king to arise, and he will exercise dominion, radah. He will do what Adam, we will see, failed to do. Psalm 72, another passage about Jesus. Here, Psalm 72, I'll read verses 1 and 8. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he, that's the king and the royal son, may he have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. May he have dominion, says the psalmist. May he rule over the whole world from sea to sea, from river all the way to the ends of the earth. May he rule the entire world. This is what a king does. And you know who this king is, because Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 through 10, you know the passage. It's the one that talks about Jesus riding on the donkey. It actually quotes this psalm. It talks about who is the man who will have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Here's what it says. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule, it's a different word for rule, but it's close. His rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. That's Jesus. Jesus is the king who exercises authority. And lastly, another one, Psalm 110, verses 1 and 2. Psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Anyway, just know that this term for ruling, it's common for kings. That's what kings tend to do. And Adam and Eve were to rule as a king and a queen over the world. Also, there's another clue that Adam and Eve are these royal figures, like a king and a queen, and that Adam is like a king in Genesis. And it's that Adam is on the earth, and he's supposed to take care of the earth. He's supposed to rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the heavens, and the beasts of the field, and the stars, and especially the sun and the moon. You remember that in Genesis 1? They're called the greater and the lesser light. God made the greater and the lesser light. He made them also, and they are ruling over the heavens. So Genesis 1:16 has this to say, and God made the two lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And he goes on, and he says, he talks about these sun and moon and stars, or the greater and lesser light. And he says that they are for signs in verse 14. And let them be for signs. Isn't that amazing? In the heavens, you have the sun and the moon and the stars. And they are for signs. And they are ruling over the night and the day. Especially the greater and the lesser light. And they are the heavenly version of these humans. Humans aren't in the heavens, they're on the earth. And humans aren't called signs, which what do signs do but point to something greater than themselves. Humans are called images. But what does an image do but point to and represent and resemble something greater than itself? And Adam and Eve were told to rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And the stars and the sun and the moon are told to rule the day and rule the night. So they're opposites. You have these earthly rulers and these heavenly rulers. And there's a whole world of wonderful biblical goodness here. But we'll just keep on our narrow path and keep going and saying there's these heavenly rulers and these earthly rulers. And the word used for the heavenly rulers, like the sun and the moon, is the same word used for Solomon having dominion as king, 1 Kings 9:19. It's also the same word as Yahweh having dominion over his kingdom, Psalm 145:13. Hezekiah has a realm, same word. And the New Jerusalem is where Jesus will reign as king and have dominion, Micah 4:8. So anyway, if the greater light and the lesser light in the heavens have this kingdom, so to speak, and they're presented as royal rulers in the heavens, and the humans are this earthly version of that, then it makes sense that the humans would also be these royal figures, which would make Adam like a king. So anyway, there's two big reasons to think that Adam is this kingly figure. He's told to rule over the world, which is pretty kingly language. And he's also like the human version of what the greater and lesser light are doing in the heavens. And the greater and lesser light in the heavens are ruling like a king. And so it makes sense that Adam would also be ruling like a king. It's a wonderful picture. It's like God is the big king, and he wants Adam as this king underneath him to take care of the world for him. God has worked 6 days, and now that he's made Adam, he can stop working, and Adam can begin taking over for him. God did good and good and good and good on day 1 and day 3 and day 4 and day 5. He did good so many times. And now Adam is made in God's image, and Adam is to go forth and do good to the world and to do good as a king who represents God, the big king, represents God as his image. And yet Adam is more than a king, if that weren't enough. Moses, when he wrote these words, wanted us to think of Adam as a priest. And there are many reasons and many ways that the Bible shows us to think of Adam as a priest. And I'm just going to give you some of the highlights once again. So I wonder if you have any in your mind yourself. Any thoughts on how Adam could be a priest? The first is that the garden is like a tabernacle. And you might think, how in the world is the garden like the tabernacle? I mean, you know the tabernacle, that's where God would dwell with his people. It was built under Moses' oversight right there at the base of Mount Sinai. The people really couldn't meet with God on Mount Sinai, so God said, fine, if you can't come up to me on the mountain, I'll come down to you in a tabernacle and be with you. You might think, how in the world is the garden like a tabernacle? Well, before we even jump into all these similarities, it's worth just thinking about similarities in general. You see, I kind of oversimplified things when I said that the author of Samuel expects that you know what has already happened in the story up before Samuel was written, like Genesis and all the books up before Samuel. He not only expects that you know, and this is really important, he expects that you not just know what has happened in the stories. He expects that you not just know what the stories say, he expects that you know how the stories said it. Every author, when they write a book, has to decide how they want to say what they're going to say. And one of the ways Moses loved to say things is by comparing one thing with another. He won't always tell you what to think about the comparison. He will just give you a list of similarities for one thing that resemble another thing. And it's up to the reader to meditate and consider, what do these things have in common? And he does that with the garden in Eden and the tabernacle. And boy, does he do it in many ways. He just gives you all these statements about the garden and all these statements about the tabernacle. And you know what? They look a lot alike. And this is Moses' way of getting the reader, getting you and me to say, okay, what do they have in common? How should I think about these two things? If Moses is trying to present them in the same ways, then that's probably a clue that I need to think about them together. Why else would he be comparing them? And so let's just think through some of these comparisons. First, if the garden is a tabernacle, or if the garden is like the tabernacle, then the people in the garden would be like Levites or like priests. Priests and Levites worked in and around the tabernacle. So if the garden is like a tabernacle, then Adam and Eve, especially Adam as the male, would be like a priest. And so, just generally speaking, where does God meet with people? Well, in the Pentateuch, God meets with people in the garden. That's where he was with Adam and Eve in the garden. They could just talk in Genesis 3, and it's not treated as anything unusual. And where does God meet with Israel and his people throughout the rest of the Old Testament? Well, in the tabernacle and in the temple eventually. The priest would go in there, and the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement, right? It is the garden and the tabernacle in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's where God meets with his people. Also, the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle are both big building projects. You ever thought about that? You ever thought of the Garden of Eden as a big building project? I mean, on day 1, God's working. And on day 2, God's working. And on day 3, God's working. And on day 4, God's working. And on day 5 and in day 6, he's working. And he finally finishes work and he rests on the 7th day. This is an extended building project. Can you imagine if you worked 6 days straight on a building project around your house? You probably have, right? Well, there's another big building project in the Pentateuch, and it's the tabernacle. So like in Exodus 25 through 31, God gives all these directions for how to build the tabernacle. So these are both building projects. And not only are they both building projects, but the building projects are really, really similar. So I'm sure you know in how many days it took God to make creation. He worked for 6 days, and then on the seventh he rested. And when God is telling Moses how to build the tabernacle in Exodus 25 through 31, it's fascinating. You know how many sets of directions God gives Moses for building the tabernacle? He gives him 7 sets of directions in Exodus 25 through 31. They all begin with Yahweh said to Moses or something like that. And there's these 7 sets of directions. And what's even more interesting is that the 6th day and the 6th speech, the 6th set of direction, are pretty similar. So are the 7th day and the 7th set of directions for what they need to know for constructing the tabernacle. So the 6th day is when God makes Adam and Eve, and they're supposed to rule over the world and take care of the animals and take care of the garden and all these things. So on the 6th day, Adam and Eve take care of the garden. And in Exodus 31, 1 through 11, in the 6th speech, God has 2 men that he singles out, Bezalel and Aholiab, which are just the coolest names ever. I wish I were brave enough to name one of my sons those names. Bezalel and Aholiab. And he singles these 2 men out, if such an oxymoronic thing is possible to single 2 men out. He focuses in on these 2 men so that they would take care of the tabernacle's construction. These 2 men are supposed to take care of the tabernacle. That's their charge. And that's on the 6th speech. Just like Adam and Eve are supposed to take care of what God was building on the 6th day. The 7th day is when God rests. And it's no accident at all that on the 7th set of directions in Exodus 31, 12 through 17, you get Sabbath commands about resting. So the tabernacle and the garden are both where God meets with people. They're both these big building projects. They both the building projects revolve around the number 7. Both the building projects have similarities with their 6th and 7th installment. And they both have similar language as well. So some of this is my own translation, but notice how similar the language is whenever they finish building the tabernacle and God finishes, so to speak, building creation. This language is so similar. You have to ask, why would it be so similar? So here's Exodus 39:32. And finished was all the work of the dwelling place of the tent of meeting. And the sons of Israel did according to everything which Yahweh commanded Moses, so they did. Genesis 2, 1 through 2. And finished were the heavens and the earth and all their hosts. And God finished his work on the 7th day which he did. And he stopped working on the 7th day from all his work which he did. Isn't that incredible? So they finished the tabernacle and God finishes his work of creation. And it both says the work is finished, they did the job, they did the job. Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything which he did, and behold, it was very good. Exodus 39:43, when they're done building. And Moses saw all the work, and behold, they did it. Or he did it. I forget how that goes there, but and Moses saw all the work, and behold, it was done. There's both blessings as well. On day 6, Genesis 1:28, what did God do to humans? And God blessed them. And what did Moses do whenever the tabernacle was being finished in Exodus 39:43? And Moses blessed them. And in Genesis 2:2, God finished on the 7th day his work. In Exodus 40:33, and Moses finished the work. So the tabernacle and the garden have the same language for when the building is finished. It'd be like if I told you to just close your eyes and turn around and look at a storefront, and you did, and I'd say, okay, I'm looking at a store. I want you to tell me what the store is based off this language. And you're like, okay, I can play that game. And I said, all right, you can order online or you could take out. You go, well, I'm going to need more specifics. I say, okay. You can buy one, get one free if you buy a large. You're like, well, that helps a little, but I'm still not there. You go, okay, let me give you another. Just reading the signs on the front of this storefront. It says that they're now serving with a better quality pepperoni. You go, oh, I think I might know what you're talking about, but give me one more clue. I say, okay. It says Domino's on the front of the building. And you go, oh, it's Domino's Pizza, right? You know that it's Domino's Pizza because you know that language. Order online, take out, pepperoni, Domino's. Moses is doing the same thing. He's sticking all of the tabernacle language on the garden. And you have to ask, why would he stick tabernacle language on a garden? Well, you see pepperoni pizza language on a store, you know it's a pizza store. You see tabernacle language on creation in the Garden of Eden, you're supposed to think, oh, God created the world to be his tabernacle. The garden was supposed to be like a tabernacle where humans and God could be together. And if the garden is a tabernacle, then the workers in it are priests and Levites. Both the garden and the temple, the tabernacle, also face eastward. Genesis 3:24, Numbers 3:38, both facing the east. And it's not just up to you and me to just infer that if the garden is a tabernacle, then Adam is a priest or a Levite. No, priest and Levite language actually describes Adam. So in Genesis 2:15, this is what God told Adam to do. God said, well, the text says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. The combination of those words, to work and keep, within the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, they pretty much exclusively show up for only one type of people, and it's the Levites who are taking care of the tabernacle. That's really about it. Every once in a while it shows up for how Israel should obey and keep the commandments. But most of the time, this language of working something and keeping it, that's how the ESV has it, at least here. That language in the Hebrew, that language is what Levites do. So I'll just read some more verses here. Numbers 3:7-8. They, that's the Levites, shall keep guard, that's one of the words, over him and over the whole congregation before the tent of meeting as they minister at the tabernacle. Minister is another one of those 2 words for work it and keep it. Sadly, the ESV doesn't keep the translations consistent all the way. And verse 8 goes on in Numbers. They shall guard, that's one of the key words, all the furnishings of the tent of meeting and keep guard over the people of Israel as they minister at the tabernacle. So these 2 verses describe what the Levites do, and they are working and keeping, or as the ESV has translated, they are keeping guard and they are ministering. They are ministering. Numbers 8:26. They minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting by keeping guard, but the retired Levites shall do no service. Thus shall you do to the Levites in assigning the duties. Here it is again in Numbers 8:26. It's talking about the retired Levites, and they are to keep, but they are not to work, because the work is left for those Levites who are still in the tabernacle. So they can keep up some things, but they can't do all the work, because then the people who aren't retired won't have a job. It's the people who have a job, those Levites still working, they are to do the working and the keeping. And Numbers 18:7, and you and your sons with you shall guard your priesthood for all that concerns the altar and all that is within the veil, and you shall serve. There it is. Guard and serve, or keep and serve, or keep it and work it. Same language. I give your priesthood as a gift, and any outsider who comes near shall be put to death.
Thanks for joining us for Gear Talk. If you have questions about biblical theology you'd like us to address on future episodes, email us at geartalk@handstotheplow.org. Also, check out handstotheplow.org for resources designed to help you understand the Bible and its teachings.